Hello. So we're going to pick up with interesting mammalian reproductive strategies. So if we think about the usual way things work, there is a sequence of events that starts with copulation, next comes ovulation, then the egg that has just been ovulated becomes fertilized by the sperm. That uh, that fertilized egg starts to divide, so 2 cells, 4 cells, 8 cells, and so on. And at some point, when it reaches a ball of cells, it is moved from the oviduct to the uterus and implanted in the uterus, and that's when pregnancy starts. That progresses to the point where the offspring is ready to be born and you have birth. So that's kind of the usual sequence of events that happens in most mammals. But what we see in some mammals is some really interesting variations on that. So starting with the things that happen, the variants that happen early in the process, the first variant we have is something called delayed fertilization, and that's just what it sounds like. You have copulation, but instead of anything happening, at that point the female just stores the sperm, and then at some point in the future she'll ovulate. She already has the sperm within her reproductive tract, so the sperm that she has will fertilize that egg, and everything else finishes off just the normal way. We see this happening in bats. It's the only species of mammals that we know of that stores sperm over a long period of time. And the way that it occurs within bats is that copulation occurs in the fall. This happens in species of bats that hibernate over the winter, so they're very small in body size. They eat insects. The insects are not flying around in the middle of winter, so to keep the costs of metabolism low during the winter, they enter hibernation, so they lower their body temperature, their respiration rate and energy requirements also fall at the same time, and that way they can get through a very long period of time without taking in any food. So before the winter hits, the males and the females are mating. Females are storing the sperm in their reproductive tract, and then in the springtime, when the insects, it starts warming up, the insects start flying around again, and they come out of hibernation. The bats come out of hibernation and start eating those insects. At that point, the females will ovulate, the eggs will be fertilized, and they'll carry on with pregnancy the same way as most other mammals. The reason that this is really advantageous for the bats is that if they were to wait until springtime to mate and then do things the way most mammals normally do, that would decrease the amount of time that the offspring have to be able to grow. And their size at the end of the growing season is absolutely critical, because they're going to be going into another winter. They'll only survive the winter if they're fat enough, if they have enough food reserves from all the things they've eaten all through the summer and the fall. If they don't have all those fat reserves, then they'll die. So it's a huge advantage to give birth as early in the spring as possible. Females can gear up ovulation fairly quickly in the spring, but it takes males a bit longer to gear up sperm production, because sperm are complicated, as we talked about before. It takes them a long time for the cells to divide and for them to assume the shape that sperm cells have, and to be ready to swim and fertilize eggs and all that stuff. So by mating in the fall, the females can have that sperm on hand, so that as soon as they can ovulate in the spring, they can fertilize that egg. If they were to wait in the spring until the males were able to gear up spermatogenesis, making sperm, then that would delay the birth of offspring, and those offspring would end up smaller and less likely to survive through the winter, because they didn't have enough lead time preparing for the winter to be able to make it through. The second odd variant that we have, or this unusual sequence of events, is something called delayed implantation. And in that case, there's copulation, there's ovulation, there's fertilization, early development starts, so the egg starts dividing into 2 cells, 4 cells, 8 cells, and so on. And then when it reaches about 100 to 200 cells, it's a bubble of cells at that point, it enters a period of dormancy. And At this point, it's reached the female uterus, but it doesn't implant there. It just kind of sits and doesn't divide anymore. And that period of dormancy can last anywhere from a few days to a few months. It's very, very unpredictable. In different species, it happens in different ways, but at some point, for reasons that we don't well understand, development will start up again and the egg will implant, the embryo will implant and finish development normally. Giant pandas are one of the species that do this. There are many carnivore species that have delayed implantation, and that's another one of the reasons, besides pseudopregnancy, that it's very difficult to know whether or not a female is pregnant, because not only do you not know whether or not she's pregnant, but you don't know when to expect the offspring, because it's not a set time from when they've mated to when the offspring are born. There's this very flexible window of time when the female may have delayed implantation going on, and there may be nothing happening. The embryo is just sitting waiting for a signal from the female to continue with development. We don't understand what triggers the period of dormancy or the end of the period of dormancy. We do know that it may be influenced by resource availability. So it may be that females, if they encounter periods of low resource abundance, may have a dormant embryo for a while, and then when resources become more abundant, that could trigger the onset of further development, but we don't know a whole lot about how that happens. There are even some species that have what we call an obligate period of delayed implantation or dormancy prior to implantation. And in that case, it's when the period of time that it takes for the embryo and the fetus to develop is out of sync with the pattern of mating and giving birth in the species. And we see this in seals and sea lions. In these species, they give birth once a year on dry land, and they're only on dry land for a very short period of time. So seals and sea lions live almost their entire lives in the water. But there's one period of time when they come out of the water for a few weeks at a time, and during this time they give birth, they mate very quickly after that, and they are also molting, so they shed all their hair and they grow in a new coat of hair, and that's one of the reasons they can't be in the water at the time, because they're not able to insulate themselves against losing heat to the watery environment. So those three things happen in very quick succession, and it only takes a few months to create a baby seal. So if there was no period of dormancy and the embryo started developing right from fertilization, it would be born mid-year and not 12 months later when the seals are out of the water. So there's a built-in obligate period of dormancy where the egg doesn't continue dividing. So early development happens, then for several months it just sits there in the female's uterus, and then development will start up again, and that will create the correct timing so that the females are giving birth at the time when they just come out of the water to mate. The third strategy is called delayed development, and it's very, very similar to delayed implantation. You have copulation, you have fertilization, but in this case you have implantation into the female's uterus, and then the period of dormancy starts. So the embryo ceases to divide for a while, and then you have resumption of development. This has only been seen in bats. Bats actually do all of the things that I've mentioned. They have delayed fertilization, they have delayed implantation in some species, and they have delayed development in other species. And it was only found in doing analysis of the tissues of bats to see what was going on in the uterus. So it was sort of discovered by accident that you have this variant that after implantation goes through a period where everything stops. This is less well known than the other reproductive variants that we've talked about, but we still think it's related to the timing of resources. So it's another way of getting around the problem of having a developing embryo during a time when the resources aren't there to support it, or giving birth at a time when the resources aren't around to allow survival of the newly born offspring. The fourth strategy is embryonic diapause, and this is actually very, very closely related to delayed implantation. As a matter of fact, in some texts and in some papers, you'll see that they're treated as exactly the same thing. But there is this other term, embryonic diapause, that's used in certain cases when we're talking about metatherians like kangaroos. So this is a situation where there's delaying of the development of the embryo, and we understand very well the circumstances in which this happens. It is an automatic thing that a lot of species of kangaroos do. So after they give birth to one offspring, they'll ovulate and mate again, and they'll have an offspring that will be retained within the uterus but not developing. And as long as the previous offspring is alive and is attached to a nipple and is drinking milk, then that the fertilized egg that's in the female's uterus will just sit there and not develop any further. As soon as that earlier offspring is weaned, or if it dies before it's weaned, that will trigger the resumption of development in the embryo that's in the uterus. So in this way, females can have offspring in pretty quick succession. There's always sort of one on reserve, a backup that's ready to quickly be born if the preceding offspring is either weaned or dies unexpectedly. And finally, we have spontaneous abortion, and that's sort of a different kind of event that happens later in development. So here we have copulation, fertilization, implantation, and early in the implantation phase, sometimes females will expel the developing embryos from the reproductive tract. And it occurs in very, very specific circumstances. And we've seen it in several species of rodents. What happens is, in these species of rodents, males tend to be infanticidal. Doesn't happen in all species of rodents, but in some species they are. What that means is if a male runs across a bunch of very young mouse pups of the same species, he'll kill them. And that only happens if their mother is unfamiliar to the male. So if the male runs into his own offspring, or the offspring of a female that he's mated with, he's not infanticidal. But if he runs into offspring of a female that he's not mated with, he'll kill them. Females will have home ranges, places where they go about their daily activities, that overlap with potentially several males. So they don't share home ranges completely, they don't share nesting areas, they don't live in close proximity to the males, but they do encounter them from time to time because they have some overlap and they have some shared areas, but not completely overlapping shared areas. When a female mates with a male, and she continues to run across him from time to time, they're familiar with each other because of their smells. And so when that male runs across the offspring of that female, those offspring are going to smell like her, and he's going to recognize that they are offspring of a female that he's mated with, and he won't kill them. She may encounter other males, or the offspring may encounter other males, and oh, my computer just went to sleep. All right, in that situation, if she encounters other males while she's pregnant and the male that she mated with has disappeared, that's when spontaneous abortion happens. Right? So a female who's pregnant and runs into a male that's unfamiliar, if she hasn't run into the male that she's mated with recently, she will abort that litter. If she runs into a strange male while she's pregnant and she's still running into her mate, he's still around, she can still smell him around, even if she doesn't encounter him directly, then she will continue with that pregnancy and those offspring will be born. So she physiologically reacts to the presence or absence of the male that she's mated with. When he's around,